Start recording. Okay. Uh, Hello, welcome to the lecture on pathology and death investigation. My name is Jason Linville, and this lecture is being recorded for JS 110 Introduction to Forensic Science. This is being recorded in the summer of 2010, the summer of 2016. It's July 20th. I always like to timestamp these. So that means if you're accessing this lecture in future semesters, all the material still applies about pathology and death investigation. But if I mention anything specific to the summer course, like assignments, quizzes, upcoming quizzes, the fact that I'm slowly getting those past two assignments graded, but I haven't gotten through all of them yet, you can ignore all that information. Okay, so let's review quickly where we're at in the summer of 2016, as well in the course for most of you. It's typical where we start out talking about different types of evidence. We had blood, fingerprints, trace evidence, drugs, et cetera, and now we begin the shift to where we're talking about these occupations that not a chemist or biologist will be hired to work in a lab, but they're related to forensic science, obviously, if we're dealing with the medical examiner here, the pathology and the death investigation. But it's a slightly different career, so they don't necessarily receive bits and pieces of evidence from a crime scene. Although with death investigation, and that's actually not accurate. I mean, it's still where these individuals are receiving evidence from the crime scene, but the process is a little bit different. For death investigation, the medical examiner, the evidence that they're receiving from the crime scene is the body. All right. So, but they have to ask a lot of questions about, like with blood, typically you have to answer, is it blood? And then who did it come from? With drugs, you have to answer it, okay, what is this drug? But with a body, there are actually several questions that come in that the medical examiner is in charge of answering. What is the cause of death? What is the manner of death? What is the identification of the body? So in answering each of these specific questions, that comparison comes into play where you're comparing two things, and then you have to determine whether it's a definite conclusion or a maybe conclusion. So we want to sort of think about that as we go through this lecture. Okay, and we're going to take those questions sort of one at a time. So we're going to talk about the role of the forensic pathologist, and when we talk about the role of the forensic pathologist, we're also going to discuss the terms medical examiner and coroner, because those three are used very similarly, but they're slightly different occupations, I guess. There can be some overlap there. And then we're going to talk about what the medical examiner does. One of the things is determining cause of death. And when we get into the cause of death, we're going to talk about some of the things that the forensic pathologist would look at if they're dealing with a criminal investigation. Because medical examiners, if it's an unexpected death, if it's a death in an auto, if an auto accident is found, or if it's, a young person drops dead who, wasn't undergoing treatment for any specific disease or something, then that will go to the medical examiner and they'll perform autopsies. But here, in this lecture, we're going to be focused more on homicide, suicide, accidental deaths, and the role of the forensic pathologist in determining that. Okay, and then the other thing that they do is they have to put the, well, we're going to look at several different categories of death, but like the homicide, suicide, accidental, that's one category that the forensic pathologist has to put the death into. And then also we're just going to go through things like for electrical deaths, for blunt force trauma deaths, and just look some of the traits that are associated with all of those deaths. Okay, so for the role of forensic pathologist, we want to answer the questions of what is the difference between a forensic pathologist, coroner, and medical examiner. And you can imagine on the quizzes and exams, it's going to be what is a forensic pathologist, and there'll be 4 answers. Or who is the person that is elected and has to deal with the dead body, or in A, B, C, D, and you'll have to be able to answer whether it's pathologist, coroner, or medical examiner. So I may give you a definition of the job or the job itself in the form of multiple choice questions. Okay, but more importantly, we want to understand, okay, in Jefferson County, how do things work? If a homicide happens in Shelby County, how do things? If a homicide happens, in any county in the United States, even though the system may be a little bit different, there are common role players that are involved with basically collecting the evidence, so collecting the body from the crime scene, and then it gets shipped to the medical examiner, and the medical examiner does certain things to that evidence in order to answer the important questions. So in a way, the medical examiner and the dead body is treated just like any other piece of evidence. Okay. Now the term coroner is what we're going to start off with. And the coroner, the technical definition of the coroner is the crowner of the king. And so back in the olden days, in the Middle Ages, when kings were kings, when the king died, they had an official person to announce, okay, the king is dead, long live the new king, whoever the next king is. So it's sort of that transfer of power after the king dies. So this is where the word originated, crowner from the king. And originally that job went to a judge, sort of, and this is not quite Middle Ages, but more modern times, where it went to a specific person in the legal system who would legally declare the king dead, and then, I guess, crown the new king. So coroners sort of evolved into not just the person who was whose job it was to declare the king dead, but it evolved into just inquisitional judges. So not just dealing with the king's death, but in all deaths, and not just all deaths, but also other crimes as well. So they would, the judges would not just, sort of render the verdict and determine with it, but they would actually investigate the death. So if you were a legal person, part of the legal system, and your job was to investigate death, then obviously looking at the dead body and collecting evidence from that dead body, or, a body's on the ground, and just in layman's terms, if we saw a bunch of what looks like knife wounds in the body, then we can probably conclude, oh, it looks like this, person was stabbed to death. All right. But they really had no medical background. They had no forensic science background. So that was coroners. And in early America, coroners were elected officials, so not necessarily judges, but they were still elected officials, okay, so elected to the government system here. They didn't require any medical training, but they were involved with investigating deaths. And we still have this system around today, not in every county, but in some counties like Shelby County, they will elect a coroner, and the coroner will be in charge of not necessarily investigating the death, but working with law enforcement and the medical examiner in order to make sure that the body is properly documented, collected, and delivered to the medical examiner, and then the medical examiner sort of takes over from there. Okay, so if it happens in Shelby County, if a murder happens in Shelby County, the Shelby County coroner will be the one to show up at the crime scene, or the deputy coroner, and they will work with law enforcement to process the body. And then the body will come up to Jefferson County, because Jefferson County has the medical examiner's office, or it may go to the state, because the state has a medical examiner, and there's a system within the state where counties that have deaths, that either aren't close to a big county like Jefferson County, need to have the body examined and taken care of. Okay, so it's similar to the state system in Alabama, as far as no matter where you're located, if you're going to collect any type of evidence, you can submit it to the state system in order to have it analyzed. Or if you happen to be in a county or a city who does some crime lab stuff, like in Birmingham City Police, they do firearms and fingerprints. And within Jefferson County, they have their own medical examiner system. So they have their own medical examiner system. And I think Jefferson County works with Shelby County, where the bodies will go to Jefferson County for analysis. But if they're in other counties, they may go to the state lab system. Okay. So notice that the coroner is not conducting autopsy. It's not like we're electing some Jimmy, okay? All right, Jimmy, you're a coroner, so I guess you need to cut open this dead guy, even though you don't have any experience. No, they're more or less take the role of coordinating with law enforcement to make sure the body is delivered to the medical examiner, whoever that might be. I couldn't find a good picture of a coroner, but if this helps remind you of any, if you've seen The Wizard of Oz, there was the coroner of Munchkin Land, and he's the one who declared the Wicked Witch truly, absolutely dead. I forget it exactly. I think the sincerely was in there someplace. So that's yeah, I mean, that guy, you wear a hat like that, you're going to get elected to office. But does he look like he has any medical training? Probably not. Okay, so that's a good way to remember who a coroner is, I guess. I don't know who the medical examiner of Munchkin Land is. I don't know what they ever did. Well, no, the Wicked Witch, I mean, her feet curled up under the house. No autopsy required, right? All right, now that stupid song is going to be in my head for the rest of my life. And I don't know any of the words. Truly something, dun, 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 and then it just starts up again. I'm coroner of, okay. Where were we at here? Let's move on to medical examiners. All right. Eventually, the legal system and the government system realized, hey, you know, for investigations of death, as opposed to just having some appointed judge, this coroner, investigate the death, the coroner really needs the assistance of a medical doctor who is trained to conduct an autopsy and can get a lot of information from the dead body. All right, so why not have a medical examiner replace this coroner? You know, we don't really need a coroner. We'll just have a medical examiner, and all bodies will go to the medical examiner, and the medical examiner's office will be in charge of processing the bodies at a crime scene. All right, so for big cities, urban areas, where they wanted to hire their own medical examiners, i.e. Jefferson County, then you would hire medical examiners and their office would take care of anything. The coroner no longer existed. But for smaller counties still, you know, Shelby County, who might not want to hire a medical examiner for their county, then they just have a coroner that coordinates with the medical examiners in the state, okay? So the medical examiners were these individuals that had a medical background, a medical degree, and they were able to conduct the autopsy and actually analyze the body, not just sort of look at it and make judgments, you know, just using layman's terms. Or excuse me, using common sense, I guess is the proper term there. Okay, so if that's a medical examiner, what's a forensic pathologist? Well, all medical examiners are forensic pathologists in that they have studied disease, and they need to study disease in order to become a medical examiner. But not all forensic pathologists are medical examiners. So pathology is the area of study, and if you study pathology, one job title that you can get is medical examiner. You can also work for a university and become a professor in forensic pathology or a research scientist in forensic pathology. So again, pathologists can do other things, but one of the main things that most pathologists do is they become the medical examiners. Okay, so forensic pathologist studies disease and learns how to determine the cause of death. Excuse me. So the pathologist, you know, originally when the system was coming into play, the police and the coroner, they would just hire pathologists to perform the autopsies. Okay, but okay, go ahead in there then. Mom will help you. Sorry, I forgot to lock the door. The good news is that my son is going to go pee-pee on the potty, so I don't know if that's important information for everybody else, but I'm pretty happy about that. Okay, so forensic pathologists became these pathologists that were assisting, and then eventually they evolved into the role of medical examiner, where they did the role of the pathologist conducting the autopsy and the coroner involving collecting the body at the scene. Okay, so medical examiners are forensic pathologists. This is a background of their education, which we've gone over in the education lecture in the beginning of the semester. Medical examiners, they also have the medical examiner's office. There are some, because criminal justice students are often interested in support positions at the, you know, if you don't want to go through med school and become a medical examiner, are there other things that you can do with the medical examiner's office? And they do tend to have some assistants. The assistants in Jefferson County, I think there's just 2 of them. One of them is a graduate from our Masters of Forensic Science program, and she had a strong background in biology. So in Jefferson County, and this is not necessarily the case, in all medical examiners, but they're looking for somebody with a background in biology who knows a lot about anatomy, that doesn't perform the autopsies but can assist the medical examiner with preparing bodies for autopsies, taking notes, et cetera, et cetera. It's sort of a high-level technician job, I guess. There are also roles of, and it's not here on the slide, roles of death investigator, and oftentimes there's a job posting for death investigator in the first assignment that you guys do this semester, and my memory is not good enough to remember if one happened to be posted the week that you guys were doing that assignment. But with death investigator, it tends to be where the medical examiner's office is looking for somebody like a retired cop who has very close ties to law enforcement, because the death investigator or death exam, I'm trying to think, there's a couple different names for it, but that position within the medical examiner's office, they're in charge of going to the crime scene and recovering the body. They sort of play the role that the coroner does in counties where they elect a coroner. Okay, so there is this role of death investigator that does not require you to be a forensic pathologist, but usually it's looking for somebody who already has a lot of law enforcement experience, so they sort of know from the law enforcement side how the crime scenes work. All right. Okay, so let's go back to the medical doctor, the forensic pathologist, or the medical examiner. When a body comes in, they need to do two main things that we're going to talk about: determine the cause of death and determine the manner of death. So I want you guys to know, excuse me, we're going to have the terms cause of death, manner of death, and then also mechanism of death. So those are three terms that I want you to be able to differentiate, if we have a question that is a multiple choice question. All right. Okay. Excuse me, there's some door opening and crying going on in the background right now. All right. The great thing about working from home is it has its ups and its downs. All right. So the medical, it's not just the autopsy. So the key thing here on this slide, and let me find my little pointer. Where is it at here? The key thing here is most people hear medical examiner and they think autopsy. Okay, but the medical examiner actually does much more than just conducting the autopsy. And it's not like some other areas of forensic science where you don't want to know anything about the case for fear it'll bias you. You just want to look at the evidence and draw your conclusions on the evidence. With a medical examiner, the conclusions they have to draw about cause of death and manner of death are complicated enough where they want to gather as much information as possible. Okay, so number one, they want the medical history of the person. It's not as though, well, if I'm going to say this is a heart attack, I don't want to know that the patient had a history of heart trouble. No, they do want to know that, and that will help with their conclusion that it may have been a heart attack. So they'll look at injuries, diseases, any treatments or drugs or medications that the patient will take during death. If we're dealing with an overdose, as is often the case in celebrity deaths, the death of Prince being the most recent example, it's where, the medical examiner definitely would want to know what prescription medicine Prince was on, and then also interviewing eyewitnesses and people who knew him to know if he was taking any other drugs or medication that he was not prescribed to. Okay, so witness statements will involve, in drug overdose deaths, just the people who knew them. Also in, shootings, stabbings, then it will be witness statements that the police have caught. It makes it easy on an investigator if they have three different eyewitnesses that say, yeah, he was, standing in the street and somebody came up and shot him 3 times in the back. Okay, so now we know that we're looking for, essentially 3 bullet holes in the body. Here's another thing. The medical examiner may visit the crime scene but doesn't have to. I think oftentimes in crime scene shows they're like, nobody touched the body until the medical examiner gets here and can declare it dead. That's not how it works in real life. I mean, in real life, if you're not certain about whether the person is dead or not, then the first thing to do is try to resuscitate the body, okay? And you're going to move it, or you're not going to try to leave it in its place, or you're going to move that around. And the medical examiner doesn't have to be the one there to say, yes, this is dead. Like I said before, the death investigator or the coroner can arrive and do that job. Okay, now, If it's like the mayor shows up dead and it looks like it's a strangulation or something, then in a big case like that, the medical examiner will probably want to make sure everything's done correctly and visit the scene to process it or to help supervise. Okay, so he's collecting all these documents, eyewitness statements, but let's face it, the most interesting thing that the medical examiner does is conduct the autopsy. Okay, so the autopsies it's like on TV, it involves opening the chest and examine the internal organs. It's not as though they're going to just conduct an external autopsy. Greg Davis from the Jefferson County Medical Examiner's Office, he visits our program to give a seminar talk to our Masters of Forensic Science students about forensic pathology and what the medical examiner does. And he says one of the more difficult things in doing is, making the decision whether an autopsy has to be conducted. And for the most part, an autopsy does have to be conducted, unless it's something where the cause of death is another medical doctor signs off on it as far as it's a disease or something, but usually the one doing autopsy, a lot of times people or family will object to an autopsy and they don't want it done, but if it's necessary for the investigation, especially if it's a family member who is a potential suspect in the crime, if it's a poisoning and they're like, oh, I don't want, an autopsy to be done, then the medical examiner has to be respectful of the family's wishes, but at the same time, perform what needs to be done. All right, and for the autopsy, they're also respectful of the family's wishes. If they want to have an open casket, then they want to do the autopsy to where it doesn't leave a lot of visible marks on the deceased person. Okay. But it does involve opening the chest, examining internal organs, oftentimes taking sections of those organs in order for microscopic analysis. All right, it's not as though they take out the entire heart or liver, and I mean, you can see where sometimes in autopsies they'll take them out and weigh them, but it's not as though, and I don't know how they put them back together, what happens with that, but for the most time for the analysis, it's not like you're going to walk into a medical examiner's office and they're going to have a big liver sitting on their desk that they're poking through with a stick. Normally, if they want to examine the organs or the tissues, they'll take a small section of that and just look at the cells, damage and structure underneath the microscope. Okay, so the organs are dissected, and that means they take a small sample of it. Skulls are used for brain exams, so the brain, is an organ that the medical examiner has to look at. And again, it's very careful as far as where they cut, and if you don't have the webcam on, you can't see where my fingers are, where they saw around the head to get into the brain for exam, especially if it's head trauma or an accident, or if it's a gunshot wound near the head, then they need to do that exam. But it's done in a way where they, fold the scalp forward, and so when they fold it back, they can stitch up the individual, and there's not a lot of apparent, marks. So again, if the family wants to have an open casket, then they're still able to do so. All right, and the tissues that are collected are fixed in formaldehyde. This becomes important because it makes so they're well preserved. So if there's a question later, the medical examiner or somebody else, a third party, can look at the tissue and draw conclusions. But the fact that those tissues are preserved in formaldehyde doesn't make them good for DNA analysis. It's not impossible, but sometimes difficult to recover DNA from tissues that are preserved in formaldehyde. So you'll notice, I think on this next slide, they actually take samples specifically for DNA analysis. Now that's more recent, probably since the 1990s, that they just do automatically. All right, they will take specimens for toxicology testing. So they'll take urine, they'll take blood, they'll test those for drugs and get a toxicology report. This is the main reason why there's such a long delay in determining the cause of death for dead celebrities who have died of an overdose. Like, Prince turns up dead. We want to know by the next day, hey, what did he die of? All right, but normally it's, well, we're not releasing until we get the results, toxicology results back. Those samples get collected, go to toxicology, get processed, according to the toxicology lab schedule. And it may be a week or two later that the report comes out and the news media has moved on, but you'll notice for all these celebrity deaths, with Prince, I think it was fentanyl, which is a opioid that is normally distributed in patches as a medication pain reliever. And I think he may have been taking that fentanyl in inappropriate ways, which some people do. So, but that doesn't really come out the first day. There's rumors of what happened, but it's not until the toxicology report comes out that you really figure it out. All right, and like I said before, they'll preserve sections of tissue. Okay, and then for DNA analysis, the easiest thing to do is if the body is not so decomposed that there is blood in the body, you just put a drop of blood on filter paper or something called an FTA card, and it preserves the DNA in that blood for a very long period of time at room temperature. So that's the easiest thing to do. You can pull a couple head hair out. Remember when we talked about hairs, you need the root to do DNA analysis, so you actually have to yank them out. A student in a class I was teaching last semester found an interesting article where a pathologist or a medical examiner was suggesting using eyebrow hairs as opposed to head hairs because the DNA stayed intact, and under certain circumstances, I forget what it was, the DNA was better in there, but it wasn't a very good poster in that they demonstrated you could get DNA from eyebrow hair but didn't demonstrate that it was better. But anyhow, and preserved tissues, like I said. Okay, so usually you're just going to take a blood sample for DNA analysis. Why would you want to do DNA analysis? Well, if there's a question of the identification of the body, then a DNA report can definitely come in handy. Okay, so the autopsy is just like any other exam. You're going to take photos during the autopsy. You're going to prepare your report. And then if necessary, you will be called to testify in court. And the court date is not going to happen the same day or the next day, where you're working on one case at a time. It's going to happen months later, so you need to take really good notes so you can open up that report and be able to recall the case relatively quickly so you can intelligently testify about it. All right, a couple of the facts here. The dictation, I think we have a question about this because this is something that the book mentioned. The dictation is where you have the medical examiner and they have the microphone there and they're like, I'm opening up the heart and I'm finding an unusual object in the, or talking themselves through the autopsy. There is a dictation of the autopsy, but it's not usually done during. Okay, most exams it's dictated after. The reason is if you dictate it during the autopsy could be like hours long. So then you have this like 3 hours worth of audio that you have to go through and review and listen to review the autopsy. Whereas if you just take notes and then sit down right after the autopsy is over and then just read off your conclusions of it, it's much more compact. And then again, this is another thing, the autopsy dictation, that the medical examiner can review before testifying in court. Okay, so dictation after. Okay, so the medical examiner collects all these records, does the autopsy according to the parameters we just described. What is involved with the death investigation? What does the medical examiner have to do? Okay. Two of the things in the report that the medical examiner produces are the cause of death and the mechanism of death. All right, these two things are related, but they're a little bit different, so we're going to go over some examples and the definitions of them so you guys are able to identify the correct one on a quiz and exam. Okay, so the cause of death is the disease or injury that initiates the events that led to the death. Okay, so it's sort of like an event, all right? So a stabbing would be an injury, a gunshot would be an injury, a heart attack would be a disease, suffocation, putting a pillow over somebody's face would initiate the death. So it's sort of like the action, if you guys want to think of that. It's what caused the death. Now the mechanism of death is a little bit more technical word, mechanism, and it's more the medical physical abnormality that is incompatible with life. What does that mean? Well, in suffocation, it would be the lack of oxygen is asphyxiation would be the technical term for it. It's that lack of oxygen that causes your body to shut down. Okay, so the cause of death leads to that physical abnormality. Okay. All right, so let's go through some examples here. Richard Mall, I was thinking about Night Court just the other day. Bull and Roz, these are two characters on Night Court. I don't know if you guys, it was a show in the 80s, but did they have, this is relevant to criminal justice students, do they have court at night? Like, was that a real thing? Like, court normally happens, during the day, right? Jury during the day, but do they also have night courts, like in Jefferson County, Alabama? I don't know, but hey, things get pretty wacky in night court. So Richard Mall, who is the man on the left there, has purloined, which means stolen. After night court, then you go into game shows. I'm glad to see that game shows are making a comeback. It gives a place for these B actors to show up and demonstrate their comedic talents. Stole her lunch from the set of Night Court 2010. I wrote this slide before 2010. I was really hoping. Also, I wrote this before the episode of 30 Rock where they tried to bring back Night Court. Okay, I've wanted to bring back Night Court for a very long time, but let's stop talking about Night Court. So Marsha Warfield smothers Richard Mall with a pillow, and he dies. Okay, so this could be any other smothering with a pillow and then he dies. Okay, what is the cause of death and what is the mechanism of death? The cause of death is, again, the event, so it's the smothering. And the mechanism of death is asphyxia, lack of oxygen. Okay? All right, that was a little bit low class. Let's class this up a bit, a little bit more highbrow. Okay, we'll talk about William Blake and Siegfried. Also, this slide was made before Siegfried and Roy were attacked, or I guess Roy was attacked. So this is a little bit less sensitive than I thought. William Blake has set Siegfried and Roy's Tiger on fire. Oh my. All right, so Siegfried gets angry, obviously, and stabs him, being William Blake, in the aorta. Okay, that's not good. And, whoa, the ambulance gets into an accident on the way to the hospital. Blake dies. Here we have it's a little bit more complicated because we have a stabbing, but then we also have an accident. Now, a lot of these will depend on the details as far as, well, was it a bad stabbing? But being stabbed in the aorta, that's pretty serious business, right? So even though maybe they would have resuscitated him if they would have made it to the hospital, it's still where the event that initiated everything is that stabbing, which is the cause of death. And the mechanism of death can be something like the loss of blood. You don't have enough blood in your body to survive. So that's sort of the medical technical reason for death. Okay. The example your book gave, is where a man is shot and then he stabilizes and then he develops pneumonia, and then that pneumonia causes kidney failure, liver failure, heart failure, death, has prior lung and heart disease, and probably would have survived if not for these diseases. Even though it's those diseases combined with everything, the cause of death is still the gunshot, okay, because it sort of initiated this chain of events. Even though he stabilized after, he didn't make it out of the hospital, so he didn't fully recover. He just stabilized as far as didn't drop dead immediately after the shot. Survived for a week later with pneumonia and these other problems. So the mechanism of death, even though eventually it's not loss of blood here, the mechanism of death is his eventual heart failure. The cause of death is still that gunshot. Okay, so it's not like cause of death is always going to be blood loss for mechanism of death. It can have some complications in between. Now, you may think, he's dead, Dr. Lima, who cares? Well, if the cause of death is his heart disease or disease, then all of a sudden there's no homicide there, right? The gunshot is maybe a manslaughter charge. But if the person dies from the cause of death, the gunshot, then all of a sudden that charge is homicide. So from the legal perspective, of which you guys probably know more than I do, that cause of death is very important to investigation, okay? Just like manner of death can also be important to investigation. I'm having lousy Q&As this lecture, but can anybody tell me as I go through this slide, when do you guys think manner of death would be important? Cause of death is important because it can change the charge from like manslaughter to homicide, but does anybody want to give me an idea in the chat box here of when would manner of death be important? Like if the medical examiner has to determine the person dies from a gunshot, if he has to determine whether it's suicidal, homicidal, or accidental, you know, the person's dead. Why does it matter whether it was an accident, a homicide, or a suicide? All right, there's a couple different reasons there. So if you guys have any ideas, just find the chat box and give me an idea in there. And sometimes I should say there is a delay. So if you just typed in an answer and you're like, why isn't Dr. Linville reading my answer? It's because sometimes it takes a while to show up. All right. And Terry has a very good one there. Okay, so when it comes to like accidental versus suicidal, which is often the case in a drug overdose, and there can also be the medical examiner can rule undetermined. The insurance and the death of benefits from the insurance become a huge deal. If it's suicide, the insurance company doesn't have to pay out if it's an intentional overdose. But if it's just an accidental overdose, then that's an accidental death, and the insurance company has to pay. Okay, so the insurance company can get involved in trying to influence the medical examiner one way for another. And then also, obviously, homicide versus suicide. If it's suicide, you're not looking for a murderer. If it's a homicide, you are looking for the murderer. And that's what Jonica sort of says, the person responsible for the death to be found. Okay, so if you know it's suicide, we know the person responsible for the death. But if it's homicide, then you have to investigate and find the person. Okay, very good. Okay, so let's say we are, well, it doesn't matter whether we're dealing with a suicide or a homicide. There are different categories of death, and we're just going to sort of review these very quickly and look at some things that the medical examiner will look at for these different deaths. Because usually it's somewhat obvious as far as which category the death falls into. Okay, a bunch of gunshot wounds in the body. You're not thinking, oh, maybe this is a chemical death. You know, maybe they overdosed on something. Maybe they overdosed on bullets. No, that's not quite the right term. Okay, so that would be a gunshot wound. Okay, so in any type of mechanical death, whether it's a sharp force injury or blunt force injury, it's usually the internal damage, the loss of blood, even if it's internal bleeding, that eventually are the causes and the mechanisms of death there. Okay, so during the investigation, the medical examiner might want to determine whether it's a sharp force injury or blunt force injury. This can help the investigators know whether they're looking for a stabbing, you know, it was a knife that was used to commit the murder, versus whether it was just a beating. And if you look at these two wounds, the sharp force wound there on the left, which I can mark here, and then the blunt force injury here, I'll mark it with the B over here, you can see how the sharp force injury, it's like it was cut with a knife and it has very smooth edges. Whereas this is where it looks like the skin has just been pulled apart. For a blunt force injury, it sort of applies downward pressure on the skin until it actually tears apart. And you can see that the bits and pieces of the skin, it's not a smooth cut, it's just sort of a tearing where it's still attached. Okay, so that's an easy way where the medical examiner can look at the wound and determine sharp force injury versus blunt force injury. Okay. A couple of facts about sharp force injury. It's very difficult to determine the size of the knife with a sharp force injury, because for an injury like this, you could have like a little knife, you know, maybe not this little, go in and then sort of be dragged along the skin to make the larger wound. Or if you had a very big knife like this, okay, it may be where it doesn't go in the body all the way and the knife wound is smaller than the maximum size of that knife. Okay, so it's messy. It's not as though people are stabbed like you're putting, you know, like you're sticking finger in Play-Doh or something, and you can measure the exact depth that the knife went in and whether it was wiggled around or not. Okay, it's not a punch. It's a little bit difficult. And for sharp force injuries, if it does cause death, it's usually the loss of blood just from the bleeding. Okay, blunt force injuries, they're actually separated into firearms and non-firearms because they're both technically blunt force injuries, but the way that they're investigated is so different that it's almost as though they're different categories, so we're going to treat it as such. Firearm gunshot wounds are the most common homicide wound in the United States, most common suicide wound in the United States. The damage is due more to velocity than mass. So what that means is it's not the size of the bullet, but it's how fast it's moving. We mentioned in firearms, I think a little bit how if you're shot with a handgun, the bullet's not moving as fast, doesn't cause as much damage when it enters the body versus if an individual shot with a rifle, that bullet is moving much faster and causes a lot more damage. And I'm surprised this doesn't come off more often in the gun control debate. It's usually where it's semi-automatic versus automatic is the big discussion, but I think there's, you know, something said for velocity. Of course, then you would argue, well, what are you gonna, you know, outlaw all rifles that are used for recreation purchases? And you know, I don't really, I don't care to have a gun discussion, and I'm not strongly for or opposed on either side, but just the velocity, you know, has something to do with if the debate becomes how much damage can one person do in a small amount of time, then velocity does have something to do with it. Okay, firearm wounds can be penetrating or perforating. Those are in bold. I guess I'll ask you a multiple choice question about that, so use some creative memory technique to know which is which. Penetrating is where a bullet goes in, but it doesn't exit the body, so it's just sort of penetrates, but doesn't exudate. Where perforating, if you think of like perforations, if you're tearing out a coupon, those are holes that go all the way through. So that's when a bullet goes in, like your chest, and comes out your back. All right, and a medical examiner needs to rule that, because if they have a penetrating gunshot wound, then they're still looking for the bullet or bullet fragments inside the body. And if those can be recovered, they can be sent to the firearms analyst, and they can make a match. We actually had a firearms examiner visit our camp last week for high school students, and it was interesting because he showed like this case where they found 3 very tiny fragments of bullets, but they were still able to match it to the firearm that committed the crime. Okay, for blunt force wounds, the gases may affect the appearance of the wound as far as near contact versus near contact versus distance. What we have here is we have a contact wound, and this is an ear here, so it's the flat skull. Not only does the bullet go into the head, but also the gases coming out of the barrel of the gun can sometimes get between the skull and the skin and create this sort of like blown out appearance, as though the skin has been teared back almost like a banana. Okay, if you go farther away, you'll notice that the gases here have not entered the, it's still a gunshot wound to the head, but it hasn't entered between the skin, so the skin is still intact. It's just a hole where the bullet went through. But also these little dots in this area, it's not just freckles or old man spots. That's actually unburned powder from the gun coming out and sort of hitting the skin and creating little burn marks. Okay, so that indicates that the gun was close enough to where this unburned powder escaping from the gun was enough to cause the injury. Okay, so here we have some different types of gunshot wounds, and we can see where if it gets close, you know, the gases can go into the head. Here it's where we have some burned skin because the gun barrel was actually, and this I don't think was on the skull, so you don't get that blown out appearance, but you actually see the burning from the hot barrel of the gun making contact with the skin. If it's from a distance and it's just the bullet going through, the bullet is not going to cause those burns. And then over here, I can't remember what this picture is of, if this is a long distance or a close gunshot wound. Is this like the burning from the barrel of the gun or something? And this is the hole right there. I added new pictures last semester, and unfortunately I think that one is from your book. So I'll, you know, way to go, Dr. Lynn. We'll have to go back and take a look at that one. All right, and then this is the picture that we saw where that unburned powder, it's a little bit farther away. It's an intermediate range wound where you have that stippling is what that pattern is called. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So what I did is I accidentally put that distant gunshot wound in the previous slide where it shouldn't be. It should have been deleted. Okay, so that's an editing mistake on my part. Or wait a minute. I had a student help edit these last semester when we were changing the format of them and processing them to make sure that they were compatible with screen readers for blind students. So I'll just blame a student. How's that? Is that how it's typically done? You just blame the person underneath you? Okay. Like if I, for example, if I wrote a speech for somebody and then it turned out that it was plagiarized and I could just not, well, anyhow, we won't get into that. Okay, so yeah, so you can see for the distance gunshot wound, here is the hole, and the bullet, it's not black and burn skin, but it does sort of create a bruise around where it entered. Um, and it's also worth noting that uh, the hole, the size of the hole, you can't determine what gun made that. So in other words, if you have a perforating wound where the bullet went in and out the back, so all you have is the body in two holes, you can't tell whether it was made with a 22 or a 45. It doesn't make a perfect punch into the skin, and the medical examiner doesn't try to make that determination. Okay. Now, if you do have a perforating wound, where you have a hole in the chest and a hole in the back, it could be very helpful to an investigation, essential to investigation, determining whether the person was shot in the chest. You know, if a person is claiming self-defense, whether that person was shot in the chest and it exited the back versus they were shot in the back when they were running away and it exited the chest. And typically this is something that a medical examiner can do. It's usually where the entrance wound is smaller than the exit wound, which may not really make sense because the bullet's probably moving a lot faster during the entrance wound than the exit wound, but it's because the internal organs sort of stretch the skin and allow it to make more of a punch. And we could even see in that previous slide here that, you know, that it doesn't look like it's a lot of damage. It's just sort of like a little punch in the skin there. Whereas an exit wound, when it's coming out, the skin can sort of, not quite like the gases, the contact wound that we saw before, but it can sort of like tear the skin where the skin sort of explodes out, and the damage can be a lot more severe. Now, if the person is wearing, you know, tight clothing, or if the back is up against a wall or something like that, then that may provide shoring and the exit wound will not be bigger. But it's sort of the rule of thumb is the entrance wound is smaller than the exit wound, okay, even though it's not true all the time. But it's definitely not like conventional wisdom might tell us, oh, the entrance wound is going to be huge, you know, they get shot and their skin like explodes everywhere, and then it's very tiny coming out the back. No, that's not the way it is. Okay, so the internal damage from the gunshot, you know, these theories about an exiting bullet is wasting kinetic energy and you want a hollow point bullet that sort of expands and slows down. The firearms examiner last week actually addressed this, and he said, no, it's not as though a hollow point bullet does more damage. It's that they're made to where when they enter a body, they will expand or break apart and slow down, and it's just so they don't come out of the body and cause more damage. You know, either, if you're shooting a terrorist in an airplane, all right, then you want the bullet to stay in the, not come out and then break a window and then cause air pressure problems. Or if it's in a crowded area, you don't want to shoot an individual and have it come out and hit somebody else, or, go through a wall and out into the street or something like that. But the actual damage has more of, so the hollow points will expand and maybe stay in the body, but the damage is very similar. The damage relates more to the speed that the bullet is going. And I mentioned this before. If you're firing it from a rifle and the bullet is going very fast, then it is going to cause damage around the area that the bullet enters. And the reason is because it sort of stretches if you can imagine the bullet sort of passing through the body, it's sort of, so let me draw a head, a nose, and a chin here, there. That's a terrible face, and here we have the body. So if it's going fast through the body, then it sort of stretches all of the tissues and stuff in there, and it's almost like, in Play-Doh, where if you slowly stick your finger through Play-Doh, it may just punch a little hole and not stretch much, and this is actually maybe not the best thing to think of. But if you think of Play-Doh as you're sticking your finger through Play-Doh, it sort of doesn't just do damage around where your finger is, but it also stretches the Play-Doh in a large area around it. So you could end up having stretched and damaged tissues around a large area, not just that little hole that's going through the body. Okay, So if you want to cause damage, then shooting an individual with a bullet will cause a lot more damage than if you take a really long, sharp stick and just poke it through the person. Okay, every once in a while on one of these reality shows, you'll see like a person who's fallen into a fence and like a spike has gone through their shoulder or through their face and they still survive. And it's because, a stabbing with a pole does a lot less damage than gunshot. Okay, for mechanical injuries that aren't firearms, the most common of these are car accidents. So the medical examiner will have to do an autopsy, and typically it's, car accident is very similar to getting a severe beating with a baseball bat. The body is thrown around and it does a lot of internal damage. For homicide beatings, most often they involve a blow to a head. It's not impossible to kill somebody with just body blows. Okay, it can be done. But typically your body's pretty resilient to that. But a knock in the head where it interferes with the nervous system and the message going from the brain to the heart to keep beating, or from the brain to the lungs to keep breathing, if that gets disrupted, then the person can die. Okay. The book mentions that, to dispel a movie myth, you can't just hit a person on the head, and I think about this every time I see one of these stupid movies, hit them on the back of the head and then they pass out. Okay, typically people don't pass out with just one blow to the head, although these are my words, not the book's, that it does not mention Vulcan or the Vulcan neck pinch grip, whatever. So maybe that still exists, for Vulcans, who I think are real, but maybe I'm wrong about that as well. Okay, put these two terms in bold, because this is just a multiple choice question. What is a contusion? Or what is an accumulated blood in tissues outside the blood vessels? All right, a contusion is, so a bruise, for those of you that don't know, is just when you break blood vessels inside the skin, but the skin doesn't break. So the blood doesn't come pouring out of your arm if you get punched in the arm. It just sort of bleeds around the area where those capillaries have been broken, and then that leads to the bruise. You can actually see the blood on the surface of the skin, but it's not leaking out, right? If a contusion happens on the head, what happens is the capillaries break, the blood leaks out, but it repairs itself. And again, this is not in the brain, but it's in the skin on the outside of the skull. But that blood can actually accumulate and harden, and because your skull's so hard, that hardening blood sort of sticks out, so that's where you get like a big bump on your head. Okay, if that happens in your arm, then it's not going to cause the skin to stretch out. It's more or less going to be just a little bump on the inside that you can't really see. All right. So let's move on from physical to chemical. So chemical trauma, this is essentially like drug overdoses or poisoning is what we're talking about here. Typically with overdoses, it involves some type of depressant or combination of drugs, which is probably most common, that slows your body down until your brain just stops sending the important signals to your heart to keep beating and your lungs to keep breathing, and then it causes you to slip into a coma and then death. All right, stimulants cause death a lot less often. They may cause seizures, because stimulants sort of speed up your body, so it's not like they slow it down to where it stops. They're speeding it up until it breaks, and that is a little bit less common to die from overdose of stimulants. Now, if it's something like speedballing, I tend to have this question almost every semester. That's a combination of the stimulant and the depressant, and that can be sort of a dangerous combination that can, sometimes mess up your body and lead the depressant to overly depress and cause your body to stop functioning. Another type of chemical trauma, and this is more poison, although carbon monoxide is sort of in a field of its own, because in house fires, oftentimes the cause of death is carbon monoxide or asphyxiation as opposed to actual burning from the heat of the fire. So carbon monoxide, the reason it's so dangerous is because, like oxygen, when it gets into your body, it will bind the hemoglobin. So the hemoglobin, where it's supposed to bind oxygen and carry it around and transport it to the different parts of your body, instead it'll bind carbon monoxide. So not only is the hemoglobin not able to carry oxygen around, but also it has a very difficult time letting go of the carbon monoxide. So it's sort of where that hemoglobin is not just out of commission for one circulation through the bloodstream, but maybe several circulations through the bloodstream. So it just limits your available hemoglobin, limits the available oxygen, and it's the same as just not breathing or being smothered, where the oxygen is not getting to the parts of your body it needs to be. Okay, so that's carbon monoxide poisoning. Other poisonings, there's a long list here, but all of them just sort of interfere with some essential biological function and just break it until your body can't function and you die. Okay, oftentimes poisons will cause something to break, cause a lot of pain, and the person will go to the hospital. But since poisons are on a molecular level, a lot of times they're difficult to reverse. Okay, so usually if you get there in time, then the body will naturally recover. But sometimes the hospital can't do much for like a severe poisoning, acute poisoning. All right. Thermal trauma, just know the terms hypothermia, hyperthermia. O is for cold, hyperthermia. Hyper is like if you think about a person shaking, because they have excessive heat or something. Both of these causes of death are hard to diagnose. Like I mentioned before, death from fire is usually due to carbon monoxide poisoning. The one interesting story I like to tell about hypothermia is when a person body starts to get really cold, it actually starts to overcompensate and the individual will feel extremely hot. So you'll often hear of cases of a person who dies of hypothermia because they're out in, they get caught in the wilderness in a blizzard or a car by the side of the road and they start hiking through the woods and they'll find the body and their clothes will be taken off. And it's sort of like, oh my God, this is, murder mystery, a half-naked body in a blizzard. But what happens is as a person gets cold, they think they're getting hot, and they actually, this has been demonstrated, more than just a couple times, start taking off their clothes. All right, so if you are in a situation where you're in extreme cold and you start to feel warm, don't start taking off your clothes, okay? Now, unfortunately, it means that you're very close to death anyway, but just sort of remember that tip where just sort of, I guess, hunker down and hope that somebody finds you. All right, well, this lecture is getting depressing. Let's talk about dying to death from electrocution. Your heartbeat relies on these electrical signals from the brain, so if you get shocked, it can interfere with those electrical signals, and that's how it can cause death. All right, so a low voltage, like sticking your finger in a light socket, can mess that up, cause the heart to quiver, and then it could stop. Okay, so that essentially sticking your finger in a light socket could cause death very easily. All right, now extremely high voltage can sometimes cause the heart to contract like very hard, like not just quiver and stop, but actually cause it to contract, and sometimes it can start beating again after that contraction. Now that doesn't mean that extremely high voltage is safer than low voltage, and it doesn't mean that I want you to go out and start urinating on high voltage electric fences or anything, but what it does mean, it's important to remember that this is where the defibrillators come into play. Okay, if a person's heart, does have a heart attack or their heart stops beating for some reason, sometimes those defibrillators, you can apply a huge voltage to the person, it'll cause their heart to contract, and then it'll start beating again. Okay, now it's not like on TV where every time they get the defibrillator out, it resuscitates the person. Okay, it doesn't work often, but it works often enough where it's worth trying in some situations, and it has saved lives. Okay. That is it. So I'm going to open this up. Everybody, you're going to get credit. I think I have all 4 of you on the attendance sheet, so you'll get credit for tonight's lecture. If you have any questions about the class or about the lecture, feel free to throw them in the chat box at this time. If not, you can just jump out of the room, and then in a couple of minutes, I'll actually stop the recording. So if you have any questions that you don't want to be recorded, then you can ask those afterwards. Because if it's about the class or something, I like to record those and answer them because more than one person may have that question. All right, thanks everybody. You're welcome. Oh, Terry, that's a very good question. I'll send out an announcement about that. Because this is summer, Terry, and this is an online class, what I suggest doing is going to the discussion board that's set up to help locate partners. So you can say, I'm looking for a partner. I'm available to work, in Birmingham on Saturdays and Sundays, or I'm free next Thursday and Friday. Whenever you want to do the assignment, and then if a person responds, you can do that with a partner. But because it's summer, and this is an online class, if a person wants to do the project by themselves, all you have to do is send me an email, say, I plan on doing this by myself. Is that okay? Let me know what you're planning on working on. I'm planning on doing fingerprints, and then I'll respond, yes, that's fine, and then you can do it by yourself. Yeah, so the partners, it's where you find them yourselves using that discussion board, or if you happen to know somebody else in the class. And then if you can't find one, you just get permission to do it solo. And also, yeah. So if and your situation is commentary. So if it's easy for you to do it yourself, then you just do it by yourself. Also, I like to remind everybody that we do have materials in the lab. So if you are doing something where you want to check out some fingerprint powder or some dental stone to do a cast of something, you just let me know and we'll make the arrangements to pick that up. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.